Hi, Dr. Warner. I'm David Delgatty, and this is my presentation for Canadian foreign policy on my term paper. My term paper is a Prime Minister's profile of John Diefenbaker, the 13th Prime Minister of Canada, who served in office from 1957 until 1963. In Canadian political history, the Diefenbaker government has always piqued my interest, and this fascination has grown recently as I have learned more about this complex and, in many ways, little-known Canadian political figure. When talking about the great and consequential leaders of our nation, names like Macdonald, Laurier, Mackenzie King, Trudeau, and even Stephen Harper immediately spring to mind. After examining the life of John Diefenbaker and the time served in office, however, I have come to the conclusion that his name definitively belongs on this list of Canadian political greats, due in part to his accomplishments while in office, but even more so to the strength of his character and his great devotion to the Canadian nation and its people. The first thing that struck me as I began to study Diefenbaker was his ordinariness, his average Joe persona. In general, the political leadership of any nation is drawn from the country's elite, the upper echelon of society, the top 1%. Those who are metropolitan and cosmopolitan, who have a long list of accolades trailing them. Not so with John Diefenbaker. He was just an ordinary citizen from rural Saskatchewan. No doubt this humble background infuriated the likes of Lester Pearson, leader of the official opposition, but the thing was, Diefenbaker was popular with ordinary Canadians. He resonated with millions of citizens who simply couldn't connect with the elite of Toronto or Montreal. He had a down-to-earth nature that came through in each of his speeches and public appearances. He was able to electrify an audience and develop a genuine rapport with the Canadian public, becoming cherished by the ordinary folk of the nation, who loyally supported him as one of their own. The next unique characteristic of John Diefenbaker which fascinated me as I conducted my research was his honest and genuine desire to serve the interests of average Canadians while in office. Not to trumpet his own agendas or fight mercilessly to hold on to his power, but to be just the best leader that he could possibly be for the Canadian public, the whole Canadian public, and not just the urban power elites of Eastern Canada. This desire stemmed largely from his humble background. As an ordinary citizen himself, he could empathize with the needs and desires and hopes of the average Canadian, and he sought to use his time in office responding to these issues. Unlike many politicians, he was very concerned with remaining in tune with the public interest, not solely for the purpose of winning the next election, but so that he could find out what his citizenry genuinely wanted him to accomplish. To quote Patricia McMahon, whom I also quote in my paper, Diefenbaker's aides increasingly began to realize the importance their leader placed on correspondence from Canadians. His reliance on views expressed in public correspondence, even crackpot letters, was phenomenal. And as Diefenbaker himself stated to the nation, "My abiding interest is your interest. My guiding principle is the welfare of the average Canadian." The third feature which fascinated me about this fascinating Canadian leader was his charismatic personality. Some PMs, such as Pierre Trudeau, have been blessed with this gregarious nature, while others, such as Louis Saint Laurent, have certainly not, to say the least. Diefenbaker most definitely belonged to the former group, and he may have well been the most charismatic of them all. A fiery orator who could leave his audiences trembling with excitement. He could whip a crowd into a frenzy as he trumpeted his vision for the Canadian nation and strove to become a personification of the Canadian will. To quote Jack McLeod, whom I also quote in my paper, Diefenbaker was unique, flamboyant, erratic, unrepentant, a renegade, a maverick. Clothing himself in legend, he was part adversarial lawyer, part thespian, part evangelical denunciator of evil, and all politician. With stabbing gestures, quivering jowls, blistering righteousness, and blazing eyes, he resembled a galleon in full sail, running before a strong wind of its own making. Dief, in full oratorical flight, was an unforgettable spectacle of remarkable, if unpredictable, power. Peter Newman concurs, writing, "Never was there a more perfect voice for a demagogue, its reverberations awakening echoes in every heart, tumid with unrequited desire." As I'm sure is evident by now, I've become quite a big fan of John Diefenbaker. After my initial excitement over the remarkable nature of this Prime Minister, I began conducting more research about his time in office, and quickly realized that one of the most exciting aspects of his government was in the area of foreign policy. It is to this realm that I wish to turn in my paper for this class, and I've entitled my paper Defending Canada, the foreign policy of John Diefenbaker. My argument is that Diefenbaker's overarching goal in the realm of foreign affairs, as in every aspect of his government, was achieving what was best for Canada and the Canadian people. He himself writes, "I have one love, Canada, one purpose, Canada's greatness, and one aim, Canadian unity from the Atlantic to the Pacific." There are many who argue that Diefenbaker was indecisive and unsure of what to do in the area of foreign relations. I beg to differ, and suggest instead that the man was in many ways a genius in international affairs, whose strategies always strove for the Canadian good, or at the very least, his perception of it in every situation. Granted, perceptions may be wrong, but in my paper I am defending his heartfelt intentions, not the political effects and consequences of his policies. Although I do personally agree with many of his foreign policy decisions and the way he handled himself, my main concern is revealing his genuine motives in this regard. In my paper, after briefly describing the duties and powers of the PM in Canadian foreign policy decision-making, and looking at Diefenbaker's personal background, I will delve into an examination of 4 key aspects of Canadian foreign policy during Diefenbaker's time in office. First, his close relationship with Britain and his advocacy of the Commonwealth. Second, his staunch condemnation of apartheid in South Africa. Third, his uneasy relationship with the US and with President Kennedy. And finally, his role in the intense issue of the Beaumark missiles. The era in which Diefenbaker served was a time of extremely complex foreign affairs, and though many other issues occurred, it is these 4 aspects in particular to which I will devote my time. After examining each situation, what took place, and Diefenbaker's motives and responses, I will also discuss the limitations that he faced and whether or not he was able to overcome them. Finally, in my conclusion, I will briefly consider Diefenbaker's legacy and what lessons may be learned by future Canadian leaders from his time in office. To further discuss the content of my paper, I will now briefly discuss the 4 key aspects of Diefenbaker's foreign policy, which will be examined in my paper. First is his relationship to Britain and the British Commonwealth. Unlike many of his predecessors, Diefenbaker had a great love and appreciation for Canada's mother country and the British Commonwealth to which Canada belonged. Therefore, he worked to maintain close ties and to further strengthen relations with Great Britain and the Commonwealth. He was not being anti-nationalistic in his close associations with the Crown, but rather saw it as the best way to rule his country and maintain Canada's heritage. The second part of Diefenbaker's foreign policy, which I will examine, is his condemnation of apartheid in South Africa, a moment in the history of CFP in which we can take great pride. Standing in opposition to the apathy of all other Western leaders in regards to the deplorable discrimination against blacks taking place in South Africa, Diefenbaker worked tirelessly to ban the discriminatory nation from the Commonwealth. As the lone white dissenter in the room, Diefenbaker ignored his limitations and stood his ground, eventually succeeding in his mission to deny South African membership. According to the London Observer, which I also quote in my paper, Mr. Diefenbaker's role was of decisive importance. Not only did he provide a bridge between the old white dominions and the new non-white members, he also demonstrated the importance of somebody giving a lead. Diefenbaker returned to Canada a hero and received a hero's welcome on his return to Parliament. His stand for equality and justice was noble and honorable, based on his determination of doing what was right, no matter the cost. The third aspect of Diefenbaker's foreign policy to be analyzed is his relationship with the US and with President Kennedy. Unlike his close ties to Britain, Diefenbaker did not have the best relations with the US during his time in office, to say the least. Contrary to popular opinion, Diefenbaker was not anti-American, nor did he wish to distance Canada from the United States. However, he was assertively pro-Canadian in his dealings with our southern neighbors. His view is concisely expressed in his personal expression, "Cooperation ever, but subservience never." He recognized the danger that Canada, with a much smaller population and relative lack of global influence, could easily be dominated by the United States, and he was not about to let that happen under his watch. For Diefenbaker, subservience was to be avoided at all costs, and Diefenbaker sought to defend the Canadian nation, its national interest, and its people in all of his dealings with the US. A consequence of Diefenbaker's staunch advocacy of Canadian independence, however, was less than friendly dealings with US President Kennedy. In fact, the two leaders barely managed to get along on a diplomatic level, much less a personal level. Contrary to the relaxed and generous treatment Canadians usually receive south of the border, the Diefenbaker era was marked by tense relations between the two nations. Diefenbaker was not one to bow to anyone, and he refused to cave to Kennedy's pressure and expectations in any situation. He stuck to his principles and convictions no matter what, and he always strove to uphold his nation and bolster Canadian pride and influence on a regional and global level. The final aspect of Diefenbaker's foreign policy, which I will examine in my paper, is his role in the issue of the Bomark missiles. To summarize the crisis, the Cold War era and increasing fears of a Soviet nuclear attack caused the US to request, or rather demand, the placement of Bomark missile sites armed with nuclear warheads on Canadian soil to assist in the defense of the continent. This issue posed possibly the greatest foreign policy dilemma for Diefenbaker during his time in office. It involved questions of costs, which were growing exponentially as the US demanded that the North American continent be vigilantly defended from the ever-present, though seemingly diminishing, Soviet threat. The issue also involved public opinion, which, as I have previously discussed, was extremely important to Diefenbaker, but was particularly hard to read and interpret in this instance. Finally, the issue involved the threat of US domination and meddling in Canadian affairs, something to which Diefenbaker was staunchly opposed and worked tirelessly to avoid. The US was putting tremendous pressure on Canada to accept the Bomarks. This was a poor course of action when dealing with Diefenbaker, whose natural inclination was to push back and resist even further. Eventually, with mounting costs, unsure public opinion, and increasingly negative US pressure, Diefenbaker made a decision once and for all. No nuclear weapons would be coming into Canada on his watch. It was a difficult decision, and one which ultimately contributed to the fall of his government, but it was made with one overarching goal in mind: the good of Canada and its people. Thank you so much, and I look forward to you reading my paper. Thank you.